everybody, and welcome back to the channel. I am sorry, I always apologize when I have to film in my bedroom. So essentially, I usually film in my library slash computer room, which is where my husband spends most of his time on his computer, and I spend lots of time reading. But whenever my kids are home and my husband needs to occupy them, he brings them to the rec room to play video games together. And that makes it too noisy downstairs for me to film. So if the acoustics slash the background are a little bit off today, then I apologize. But I really wanted to film my August wrap up so that I could get it up in time to remind everybody, or I guess let everybody know what I read in August. As September has started now, I don't want to fall too far behind. But overall, August was a really great reading month for me. I took one of my first forays into manga, finishing out a series that I had begun on TV, so watched the anime and then kind of continued to the end of the series with the manga. I read a book which is now one of my new favorite books of all time, and made progress with a couple of series that I had been reading and feeling good but not wholly invested in, but read a couple of books that really raised the bar for me and made me fall in love with those series. I also have a couple of books that I will be carrying forward into September, so I'll talk a little bit about those first. But just to kind of get it out of the way, I just want to touch on the manga series that I read this month, and that was the end of Haikyuu. So I talked about Haikyuu in my July wrap-up because I had read a bunch of the volumes that were out at that time. But in Canada / North America, the very final English translated volume of Haikyuu was released in the first week in August. And I read it and absolutely loved the ending. Haikyuu, for anyone who doesn't know, is a sports manga, which was turned into a sports anime, which is not at all the thing that I usually like. I am not very well versed in manga. I have not read barely any. I read like one or two series as a younger person. But I do watch a fair bit of anime, and sports anime, it was never something that I was really ever caught up in, but Patrick convinced me to watch Haikyuu, and I became totally sucked into it, and I could not imagine a better ending for the story than the one that was given at the end of the manga. So it was just such a wholesome story about the value of teamwork, watching people who are on a team play together, and how sport can touch the other areas of your life. It just made me really happy. The anime, I think, is really intense, very action-focused. It's very exciting. I had a great time watching it, and I cannot wait for the rest of the manga to be translated over into that medium. I think it's going to be so much fun to watch the rest of the story come to life. But I had such a good time reading the ending. I really, really loved it. So that was it for the manga. Other than that, I read mostly fantasy. I think I read all fantasy. I'm just checking my little list over here. But yes, everything that I read this month was fantasy. There was one work of YA fantasy, and the rest was adult fantasy, with even my non-fiction selection for the month being in the fantasy realm. And I guess I can touch on that first because that's a little bit outside of the others. But the work of non-fiction that I read this month was a book called Wizardry and Wild Romance by Michael Moorcock. And for anyone who doesn't know, Michael Moorcock is very well known for his Elric series. He's written a bunch of other things as well, but Elric is kind of the shining star of his bibliography, I guess. That's what most people know him for. But he was also quite the literary critic, and obviously after reading this book, I know that he devoted a lot of time to critically analyzing and having critical discussions about the fantasy genre as a whole. And after reading this compilation of his essays, which is essentially what this book is, I feel like I have a better understanding of him as a person. And I'm also really looking forward to reading some of his work. So the essays in the book, the reason that I bought the book is because it holds an essay called Epic Poo, which is a critical analysis of the fantasy genre and the inherent romanticism of modern fantasy, and kind of equating some really well-known and beloved fantasy stories to the equivalent of Winnie the Pooh for children. So I did not agree with everything that he said in these essays, but it did give me a lot of fruit for thought. There was a lot to think about in this collection, and I really appreciated that Michael Moorcock just really went there with his opinions. He did not hold anything back, and while his opinions were scathing at times, I didn't think that it was incredibly gratuitous. I think that there were definitely some points that he made that could have been delivered a little more gently, but he was very open and very frank about what he didn't like and what he admired in modern fantasy, and I appreciated that. It was very refreshing. Like I said, he had a lot of opinions about books that I really love that I don't necessarily share, but I thought that it was very engaging and it taught me a lot and led me to think about some things about fantasy that I hadn't previously considered. It also gave me a wealth of recommendations for fantasy books to check out, books to read. At the back of the edition of the books that I have, he even gives some reviews of particular fantasy books that he really enjoyed. So I thought that this was well worth reading. It was very difficult to get my hands on a copy. I actually couldn't get one shipped to Canada, so I got one secondhand. I think it might have been from Amazon, but I'm not sure. It could have also been from another site. But I ordered one secondhand to my friend Laura's house, and she was kind enough to then mail it to me here in Canada. So it took a little bit of navigating in order to get the book to me, but I thought it was well worth it. If you like critical analyses of fantasy, if you enjoy getting some of that perspective, then I think that this is well worth reading. I'm not going to dive into the individual essays because I actually want to put together a video combining some of the thoughts and quotes from Wizardry and Wild Romance along with a review of Moorcock's Elric saga. So once I read the first book in that saga, I will put that video together and talk a little bit more about this collection. But I thought that it was really interesting and would definitely encourage people to read it if that's something that interests them. Again, I also read one work of YA fantasy this month, and just to get that out of the way so I can kind of cover all of the adult fantasy at once, this was the conclusion of a YA fantasy series that I really enjoyed, and that was Any Way the Wind Blows by Rainbow Rowell. So this is part of the Simon Snow series, which she had written as kind of a satire / spoof on the Harry Potter series, and it follows a chosen one named Simon Snow and his friend / nemesis Baz, who he believes is a vampire. And it's kind of his mission to track him down and catch him and you know, be the foil to all of his evil doing, essentially, in the first book. And we follow their relationship and how they relate to each other throughout the trilogy. And I really liked the conclusion. I did not really care for the second book, which was released, I think, last year, which was several years after the first book, Carry On. And while I didn't really love the second book, which was called Wayward Son, I thought that the third book was a pretty fitting conclusion. Rainbow Rowell tries to tackle some topics that don't often come up in YA fantasy, like a deconstruction of the chosen one trope, what it means to move away from your destiny, or what happens when you don't meet the terms of your destiny, what happens next. So essentially, what happens after your epic conclusion, what follows that. And I thought that she did a really good job of that. I think really the main appeal of these books are the characters of Simon and Baz. There are a collection of secondary characters, but I think that the main characters really get the bulk of the character development, and they carry the bulk of the storylines. So I really liked the direction she took them in this third book. It was, I thought, a highly enjoyable conclusion. It had most of the things that I was looking for out of the conclusion to these books. I was speaking to my friend Laura, the friend who sent me my Wizardry and Wild Romance copy, and her take on this was that she wished that the conclusion we got in this book was book 2, and that there was another book coming, because I think she felt similarly disappointed by the middle book. And I agree with that. I would love to know that there was another book coming in this series, because I really enjoyed it, but I'm also happy with the conclusion that we were given. So those are my thoughts on that series. I know it's probably not a most of my viewers are probably not reading the Simon Snow series, but I did want to talk about it because I have been reading those books for a long time, and I thought that the conclusion was pretty good. But other than that, I read a total of 6 adult fantasy books in the month of August, and I was really happy with that. It was a busy month with summer activities and getting ready for back to school, and so there were a couple of chunky fantasy books on here, and I really ended up enjoying a lot of what I read. My very first adult fantasy novel of the month was Daughter of the Forest by Juliette Marillier. I did a full dedicated spoiler-free review for this book, so I would encourage you to check that out if you have never read this book, because I will say this has become one of my all-time favorites. I loved this book. For anyone who hasn't seen that review, Daughter of the Forest is a historical fantasy novel, and it is a retelling of the folk tale of the Seven Swans. So we have our main character, Sorka, who is the 7th child of a 7th son, and she has 6 older brothers. She is the youngest sibling and the only daughter, and she grows up totally taken care of and spoiled with affection by this family of men. And watching her relationship with her father and with her brothers is a beautiful part of this story. I don't want to get too much into plot points because you can always go and watch that review if you are interested, but I will say that things that really stood out in this book for me were the beautiful prose. I thought the writing was gorgeous. The familial relationships, I love familial relationships, especially sibling relationships in fantasy, and I don't think we get it enough. And when we do get it, it is certainly not the focus of the story as it was in Daughter of the Forest. And then finally, the main character of Sorka. She was phenomenal. She has become one of my favorite female protagonists of all time, one of my favorite fantasy characters of all time. She is determined, she is tenacious, she's stubborn, she's brave, she's loyal. She has so many amazing qualities while Juliette Marillier never falls back on that trap of feeling like you need to build your character, your female character, up in ways that are seen as conventionally male-dominated areas. So in the setting in which this takes place, obviously the male characters in the books are expected to be warriors, they are expected to defend their family, and I think in a lot of classic female-centered fantasy, you get that trope where women rise up and become warriors and want to fight and defend themselves in that way. And don't get me wrong, I do love reading those stories. I liked the Alana books. I love those stories. But I think it's also great when we can see female characters utilizing strengths or things that are often thought of as weaknesses for women during the time in which they lived, and watching them turn those into strengths and become such a strong and motivated character. So I really, really, really love this book. It was a 5-star read for sure. I loved it so much. If you have not read it, I would highly encourage it. It is the first in a trilogy, but can most definitely be read as a standalone. It has a complete arc. I don't think that if you love the writing as I did, you will likely want to read more of Juliette Marillier's work, but this feels like a complete novel. It feels like it could function very well as a standalone. So that was my read of the month for sure. After The Daughter of the Forest, I read the book The Black Coast, which I talked about in my ranking 2021 releases video. So this is a book that came out in 2020 in the UK, but came out earlier this year in North America. And it was an interesting fantasy book. I think on Goodreads I gave it 3 stars. It was good, but it did have some drawbacks that kept it from being a really great novel for me. The basic setup is that it is a multi-POV adult fantasy story where we follow primarily 2 characters who are natural-born enemies. So we have Damon, who is a young lord who lives along the coast, and then we have Zana, who is the leader of kind of a Viking-esque type people who have lived across the sea and have frequently raided Damon's people. And at the beginning of the story, they see Damon and his townsfolk see all of these raiders' ships on the horizon. And when the raiders land, they actually come under a banner of peace. And they are wanting to settle and become integrated into the society of Damon's people. And it's really a fantasy story that shows the struggle of two separate cultures that are very distinct and have this history filled with animosity, trying to come together and work together and get to know each other. And it is a very fascinating approach to a fantasy story. I have not read a fantasy series that deals with this topic so intricately. There's a lot of cultural world building. You can really see the beliefs, the morals, the motivations, the religious rituals, all of those types of things for each of the two peoples are very distinct, and the author goes over them in great detail. So if you really like those types of things, then I think you should probably give this a try. To me, some of that felt a little bit on the nose. It felt almost textbook, like we were getting like, and this is bad according to people number one, and this is good according to people number two. Like there wasn't a lot of subtlety or a lot of nuance in the delivery of some of that information. But if you are someone who really likes, like I said, that kind of anthropological or cultural world building, I think that the author, Mike Brooks, has done a great job in making these two cultures feel very distinct and very real. There are a variety of other POVs, but to be quite honest, they don't ever really live up to these two main characters, and it feels like there's a lot of loose plot threads that are happening kind of in the background. I am imagining that these will start to coalesce as the series goes forward, and I will be continuing with the series. I definitely liked it enough, and I am invested enough in these characters and what's happening to them in order to want to continue. So I'm hopeful. I'm really sorry, you can probably hear my kids yelling in the background, but I'm really hopeful that I will continue to enjoy this and that the series will probably just get better and better as it goes on. After that, there were two series that I was continuing, and I read books from each of these series this month. So the first of which was the Dresden Files. So this month I read book 5 in the Dresden Files, and then put together a video. I can link that below if you'd like to check it out, kind of about my feelings about Dresden after reading the first 5 books. In that video, a lot of people gave me the opinion that they think that the series really takes off at book 7. They feel like book 7 was an intense turning point for them, and that's when they really started to fall in love with the Dresden Files. But I have to say that I have really been enjoying it. I DNF'd Dresden when I read the first book a really long time ago. Well, I didn't DNF it, I guess. I read book 1 and just didn't continue with the series. But after picking up book 1 again last year and continuing with the first 5, I'm really enjoying my time with Dresden. Dresden, in this book, which is called Death Masks, he has to find a holy relic, so that is his goal for the book. And what I really liked about this one, without getting into any spoilers for any of the Dresden books, I think that some of the primary or even background antagonists have started to become more multi-dimensional. Some of the recurring characters who show up over the course of Dresden, who kind of interact with Dresden in his day-to-day life in Chicago, I felt like we were able to get more of their background, some of their motivations. So I really liked part of that. It makes the series feel more rounded. It makes me more invested in the world building and in the series as a whole. I think that some of the new villains that popped up in book 5, I'm assuming are going to be villains that are going to continue along with the series, and that makes me excited because I want to know where they're going to come back and what they're going to do and what's going to happen. And I have to say that the longer I spend time with Harry Dresden, the more he grows on me. He has quirks and personality traits that I find very difficult sometimes, but I think that Jim Butcher is building a very realistic character. I think that with each book we learn a little more about Harry. He becomes a little deeper. We get to understand more of his motivations. And I really like that there is time between each of these books because we're watching Harry grow from a young man into an older adult. And I imagine that that's going to continue along the course of the series. And by the time I get up and kind of catch up to the main series, I expect that there's going to be a huge span of time that has passed in Harry's life. So I really like that. That's one of the joys of reading these long series, is watching that character development build. And I imagine that must be why so many people fall in love with the Dresden Files, because beyond that Monster of the Week or Mystery of the Week setup, you get to follow a character along throughout his life and see how he changes, how his relationships change, how his view of the world changes, what he learns, what he doesn't learn, what he should be learning but doesn't. And I think that I'm really excited to see that growth in Harry. And I'm really excited to see where the story is going to go from here. So really looking forward to continuing with Dresden. And I'm really excited for book 7 now, because so many people have said that they really, really liked that one. So I'm looking forward to getting there. The second kind of longer series that I have been reading is the Death Books of Discworld. And so this month I read Soul Music, which was book 3 in the Death Books. And this is what I was waiting for. I've been wanting to read Discworld for a really long time, and I started reading the Death Books because that was the sub-series within the greater world of Discworld that I thought I would enjoy the most. And I thought that Mort was good. I liked it. Reaper Man I really liked, and I could see myself starting to really become invested in the Discworld. But Soul Music was amazing. I loved this book. So kind of the main premise is that there is a subgenre of music called music with rocks in that becomes popular in the Discworld, and it is suspected that this music might be alive. It is infecting everyone. It is throwing the Discworld into chaos, and it's up to Death and companions to find out what exactly is happening. And it is so I'm smiling so much, my cheeks are hurting just thinking about it. I love this so much. I am not the most well-versed music fan, but the musical references that are in this book are the kinds of music that I know things about. So I really like classic rock. That's what my dad listened to when I was little, so that's probably the music that I know the most about. And so a lot of the references were references that I could pick up on, which certainly helps. I think that Terry Pratchett had really hit his stride by the time he got to this third Death book. Obviously, Mort is one of the early books in his bibliography, one of his earlier Discworld books. And I think that it takes time for any author to really gain that traction, to develop their skill. But by the time he was writing Soul Music, Terry Pratchett had arrived. This book is funny, the jokes are on point, there is a fluidity to the writing that I felt like was really lacking in Mort. Obviously, Terry Pratchett has always been, or was always, very gifted, very talented, very funny, very smart. But I think that with anyone, no matter how talented you are in the beginning, you are going to build that talent over time. And I can definitely see, I can realize how that happened as I make my way through these Death books. So Soul Music was so amazing. It is the most fun that I can remember having with a book in a really long time, and it is one that I will go back to. I am sure of it. And it has made me super excited because the fourth book in the Death series is The Hogfather, which I know is Alan's favorite of the Death books and seems to be a fan favorite, for lots of people. So I'm really, really excited to read The Hogfather, and I am very, very pleased to say that the love and respect and admiration that I wanted to have for Discworld has finally arrived. So I am super, super excited to get to this next book. I am so, so pumped. Other than that, my last adult fantasy for the month was Morningstar by David Gemmell. So I started this, I think, in July. This is a book that I carried over into August. I believe this was on my July TBR. This is a standalone fantasy novel by David Gemmell and is a retelling of the Robin Hood legend. So I read the book Legend, David Gemmell's book Legend, a couple of months ago, and I really, really liked it. I wanted to read more of David Gemmell's bibliography because I know he was a big inspiration to a lot of the epic fantasy authors that I really like. And I wanted to start with some either shorter series or standalone books just to get a feel for his style and his writing. And so I started with Legend without going on to the Greater Drenai series yet. And this month I read Morningstar, and I really liked it. I don't think I liked it as much as I liked Legend. Like I said, it's a retelling of the Robin Hood myth. We follow a man named Jarek Mace, who is not at all what you would expect from a hero. We get this very gray picture of a Robin Hood type figure. So he is an outlaw, and he meets up with a young bard named Owen. And Owen is very much what you would expect from a hero. He is idealistic. He wants to do good. He wants to do good for other people. But unfortunately, he's not really that skilled. He's not really that good with a sword. He doesn't really know what to do. He freezes up at inopportune times, but he really wants to do good. And so he bumps into Jarek while he is inadvertently saving someone's life. And he believes that Jarek can be the hero that the countryside needs. And so he is kind of pushing him into these acts of heroism, and Jarek is kind of reluctantly going along. But as he continues to spend time with Owen, and as he continues his kind of escapades across the countryside, a legend begins to grow around him, and that is the legend of the Morningstar, of this man who is kind of taking from the rich to give to the poor. And so this legend starts to build, and what David Gemmell really explores in this book is what it means to be a legendary figure, what it means to be a hero, how you reconcile this heroic vision of a person with what they were actually like. And it's very interesting because we get Owen narrating the story from some unknown point in the future. And it's very well done. I think the first probably 75% of the book is pretty straightforward quest-based fantasy. There's not a lot that's new there, though I will say that David Gemmell was creating a very morally gray character during a time when we probably didn't get as many of those morally gray characters as we do now. So it probably felt very fresh for the time, even though it seems like something that is fairly routine for present-day readers. But the end of the book, the last 25%, I think there's a lot of really great exploration done there. I really enjoyed the ending, so I thought that it was definitely worth it. David Gemmell has a very accessible writing style. His books are also usually not that long, so this is pretty easy to breeze through. If you've been looking for a retelling and you don't want to read the same ones that you've heard about 1,000 times on BookTube, then I think that this would be a great place to start. If you want to dip into David Gemmell's bibliography, I think this highlights some of his strengths. There's some pretty good action sequences in there. You get to see the way that he likes to develop a plot, some of the themes that he likes to explore. So I think that this would be a fine place to start. And it will not go down as one of my favorite novels, but I still had a pretty good time reading it. So I have to say that it was definitely enjoyable, and I would recommend it to anybody who likes heroic fantasy. And I believe, I'm just looking back at my list to make sure I didn't miss anything, and it looks like I did not, but I believe that those are all of the adult fantasy novels that I completed this month. I am reading The Winter King by Bernard Cornwell, which is book one of his Warlord saga, which is an Arthurian retelling. I'm almost finished, but couldn't quite squeak it in for the end of the August wrap-up, so I will be finishing that one this week. And I'm enjoying it, but I will give you more thoughts in my September wrap-up. And I am reading Blood Meridian, which, to be honest, has been a little bit of a struggle. I am finding it difficult to connect to this book, but I am committed. I am going to make my way through it. It just will probably take me until the end of September because I'm going to be reading it quite slowly. But I will finish it. It unfortunately did not capture my attention immediately, but I will give you more thoughts on that one in September as well. So that's it. That's my August wrap up. I had a really fun reading month. I enjoyed a lot of the books that I read. I really loved a few of the books that I've read, and I'm excited to continue on into the series that I have already started. I would love to know what the best books you read in August are, if you had a good reading month, and I will see you with another video soon. Bye!